Throughout Greek mythology, there are several monsters that are said to dwell in the waters around the Strait of Messina. And today we're going to be taking a look at one of the largest, Charybdis. Now, in some tellings, she is said to be a daughter of Poseidon, god of the sea, and Gaia, the personification of the earth. However, in others, she was the daughter of the Titan Cronus and the goddess Rhea. Now, it can get a little confusing trying to keep track of all these different godly lineages, especially when some myths contradict each other. So, just know that no matter who her parents are, she is definitely a monster of colossal proportions. It's not really clear when she first appeared in mythology, but what is clear is that by the time of Homer, she was already considered an infamous monster. He refers to her in the Odyssey as a most dread scourge of men, and he further describes how she sucks down ships with their crews still inside. Now, Charybdis is usually depicted as a massive whirlpool, but in some accounts she is actually described as a sea monster with 6 heads, 3 eyes, and 12 feet. Either way, she was terrifying and deadly, and sailors would do anything they could to avoid her. The thing about whirlpools is that while you might assume that it's easy enough to steer clear of them, they can actually be really hard to spot because they often don't have any warning signs. It's like trying to navigate a minefield without being able to see the mines. You never know what's underneath the water, and a single wrong move could mean your demise. If you were sailing anywhere near the Strait of Messina, you had to decide whether you wanted to risk passing by Charybdis or risk running into her otherworldly counterpart Scylla. If you went too far to the left, you'd end up in the clutches of the many-headed dog monster, Scylla, who would happily tear your ship apart and eat your crew. And if you tried to go too far to the right to avoid her, well, you'd simply vanish from existence after being consumed by the insatiable whirlpool known as Charybdis. In this sense, they almost acted like a coin toss. You had a chance of surviving either situation, but ultimately it was up to fate to decide your future. To help explain this coin toss of fate, the Greek poet Stasinus wrote that Charybdis had been sentenced to forever be stuck in her whirlpool form after she offended the gods. The story goes that before she became a monster, she was a beautiful naiad named Cythera, or Cytheron, depending on which version you read. She lived in the highlands of Thessaly with her sister Alcyone, and together they made a vow of perpetual virginity. Well, Zeus wasn't exactly fond of that because if anyone was going to make a vow in his world, it was gonna be him. You know, like how Zeus made his own vow to never shave. So Zeus decided to teach these nymphs a lesson, and he sent an eagle to carry Cytheron away to become his bride. Obviously, she resisted as much as she possibly could, but she didn't stand a chance against the god of the sky. And after he carried her to the top of Mount Olympus, she realized it was no use trying to resist. So she threw herself into a nearby lake and was instantly transformed into a monstrous whirlpool, doomed to spend the rest of her life trapped in the body of water. Some poets also mention that Cytheron had another name, that being Typhoeus, and apparently he was so large that he blocked the entire Strait of Messina. The hero Odysseus was one of the few people that managed to escape his wrath. And upon returning home, he shared stories of his adventures with the wizard Circe. When he told her about the great whirlpool blocking the path to the underworld, she didn't seem surprised in the least. She had evidently heard rumors of a massive monster living in those waters long before Odysseus ever returned to Ithaca. Now, the imagery of the dualistic whirlpool Scylla and Charybdis has appeared everywhere throughout classical art. Sometimes she is shown as a female figure with hair in the form of a whirlpool, and sometimes she appears as an actual whirlpool. Either way, she was always shown to be extremely dangerous. In the medieval period, the image of Charybdis was used to represent the dangers of temptation. This was especially prevalent in works by writers such as Dante Alighieri and Edmund Custis. For example, in Dante's Inferno, Charon, the ferryman of the underworld, is described as having the head of a whirlpool. That's probably not very helpful when you're trying to row a boat. In addition to that, the famous Renaissance painting, The Triumph of Neptune by Peter Bruegel the Elder, also depicts her as having the head of a whirlpool. During the Age of Discovery, sailors began discovering new lands and encountering new creatures. They soon realized that the tales of Scylla and Charybdis were likely based on real events, though perhaps they had been exaggerated over the years. Many explorers claim to have seen whirlpool maelstroms similar to the ones that occur near Norway and Scotland, and it's entirely possible that ancient Greek sailors experienced something similar as well. However, in modern times, scientists have found that the only type of whirlpool that could realistically exist in those waters would be the kind that pulls things down to the bottom of the ocean instead of sucking them up towards the surface. Regardless, the myth persists, and every time someone has to choose between two undesirable options, we say that they have Scylla on one side and Charybdis on the other. In fact, the political parties of ancient Greece even used the whirlpool monster as a symbol of their opposition. Each party tried to claim that they were not Charybdis, thereby implying that their opponents were a dangerous whirlpool that would destroy everything in their path. And despite the fact that these political parties no longer exist, that exact sentiment still rings true whenever you hear someone talking about politics. People love to accuse each other of being extreme. So next time someone tries to call you a monster, just remind yourself that it could be worse. At least you're not a giant whirlpool swallowing ships whole. Speaking of which, the last time that happened was back in 1908, when the captain of a Russian ship called the Oleg nearly met his demise thanks to a gigantic whirlpool off the coast of Finland. He and his 5 crew members were sailing near the city of Peter the Great when the ship suddenly began to sink. As the waves crashed over the deck, they desperately clung to the mast until they were finally spotted by a passing steamer who came to their rescue. But the truth is that most ships aren't so lucky. In 2006, for example, a ferry carrying more than 300 passengers was caught in a monster whirlpool off the coast of Japan. Even though it took more than 2 hours for the whirlpool to fully suck the vessel underwater, none of the passengers were injured. But the ferry did sustain severe damage, leaving a huge gash in the hull. This is pretty similar to what happened to a Soviet tanker back in 1975 when it was caught in a whirlpool off the coast of Sweden. The tanker had been sailing from Tallinn to Ventspils when it was hit by unexpectedly large waves. One of these waves caused the ship to turn 45 degrees off course, and once it righted itself, it began to crack. The tanker ended up sinking in less than 20 minutes, but fortunately, all 25 crew members were rescued unharmed. But unfortunately, not everyone is so lucky. There was an incident in the Black Sea back in 2005 when a cargo ship was caught in a vicious whirlpool and capsized. 2 of the 5 crew members were rescued, but the remaining 3 perished along with the ship. And then we have to talk about the even more mysterious incidents like the one that occurred back in September of 2022. The crew of a Norwegian oil tanker reported that they were hit by a large wave that caused the ship to heel over. But then seconds later, the ship suddenly righted itself as if nothing had happened. The crew believed they had somehow survived a hidden whirlpool, but no one knows for sure. As you can see, giant whirlpools are certainly capable of destroying ships, and they're probably the real reason why ancient Greek sailors believed that the Strait of Messina was guarded by a monster. But what about those claims of Scylla existing as well? Is there any truth to that? Well, there is a passage in Homer's Odyssey where Odysseus says that he saw 60 Trojan youths being led away into slavery, but then they vanished into the whirlpool of Charybdis. So maybe she did indeed have 6 heads. On the other hand, there is a difference between seeing something and experiencing it firsthand. Perhaps Odysseus was misinformed, or maybe he was referring to some other creature altogether. So, which monster would you rather face? A massive whirlpool or a 6-headed dog monster? Let me know in the comments. Then click here to watch more videos about Greek mythology. Thank you for watching. Bye.